Hello, I'm going to do goniometry for shoulder extension, shoulder abduction, shoulder internal rotation, and elbow extension. Okay, here we go. So for shoulder extension, I'm going to stabilize the inferior aspect of the scapula, and I can also do that at the acromion process to prevent movement here. And my subject is going to lift his arm like so and back down. My fulcrum is at the greater tuberosity. My stationary arm is following the midline of the thorax, and my distal arm is following the lateral line of the humerus. Okay. So subject, you can go ahead. Good job, and that's about 35 degrees. And he is prone for this. Okay, subject, can you move to your back, please? The next one I'm going to do is shoulder abduction. I'm going to have to slide a little bit that way. Good job. Okay, so for shoulder abduction, I am going to make sure his scapula is stabilized to prevent rotation on it. And the fulcrum is going to be at the acromion. The stationary arm is going to be parallel with the sternum, and then the distal arm is going to follow the midline of the humerus. Okay, subject, can you swing your arm around? Good job. And that's about 150 degrees. Okay, subject, I'm going to have you slide over to the edge of the bed. There you go. Okay. Next one I'm going to do is internal rotation. I've got a towel to help to stabilize the scapula. I want to make sure that the scapula doesn't move, and his motion is going to be internal rotation. My fulcrum is at the olecranon process. My distal arm is going to stay perpendicular to the floor. I'm sorry, my proximal arm is going to stay perpendicular to the floor. My distal arm is going to follow the ulna. Okay, go ahead. And that's about 85 degrees. The next one I'm going to do is elbow flexion or elbow extension. And I'm going to stabilize scapula and also stabilize his shoulder to prevent movement and keeping his humerus stabilized as well. My fulcrum is going to be at the lateral epicondyle. My distal arm is going to follow the radius, the radial styloid process, and then my proximal arm is going to stay in alignment with the humerus. And your movement is up like that, okay? All right. So, okay. Go ahead. Good job. And that's about 72 degrees. Okay, next I am going to do forearm pronation, wrist extension, and radial deviation. So for pronation, I am stabilizing the humerus. My fulcrum is going to be at the ulnar styloid process. My distal arm, my moving arm, is over the dorsum of the wrist, and my proximal arm is perpendicular to the floor or parallel to the humerus. Like so. Okay, go ahead. And he has about 85 degrees. Next, I am going to do wrist flexion. Let's go ahead and hang your wrist over here. And for wrist flexion, I am going to stabilize the radius and the ulna. And his motion is coming up like this. My fulcrum is going to be at the ulnar styloid process. My distal moving arm is going to be at the 5th metacarpal. And my proximal arm is going to be parallel to the ulna. And this is not the size goniometer I would use for this, but it's what I've got. Okay, so drop it down. Okay, go ahead and flex up. Good job. Okay, the next movement that I am going to do is radial deviation. So his hand's going to be flat like so. The fulcrum is going to be at the capitate. The distal arm is going to follow the 3rd metacarpal, and the proximal arm is going to be parallel to the radius and the ulna. And I'm going to stabilize the radius and the ulna for this one as well. Okay. All right. Go ahead and deviate this way. Good job. And he has about 20 degrees for that one. Okay, now I am going to do the hip movements. That is extension, flexion, abduction, and internal rotation. First, we're going to do extension, prone. I'm going to stabilize his pelvis to prevent any tilting of his pelvis. The fulcrum is going to be at the greater trochanter. The proximal arm is going to be the midline of the pelvis, and the distal arm is going to be the lateral line of the femur. Okay. There we go. All right. So go ahead and lift your leg up. Back down. Do it again. That's about 20 degrees. Go ahead and flip over. Next, we're going to do flexion, and same landmarks. I'm going to parallel stabilize his pelvis. The fulcrum is at the greater trochanter. The proximal arm is the midline of the pelvis, and the distal arm is following the femur, the lateral femur. Okay. So your motion is bring your leg up. Go ahead. Okay, and that's about 118 degrees. Good job. Okay, the next movement that we're going to do is abduction. And I'm going to stabilize his pelvis so that it doesn't lift up when he is moving his leg away from him. My fulcrum is at the ASIS. My proximal arm is perpendicular going over to the opposite ASIS. And my distal arm, my moving arm, is following the midline of the femur. Okay. So I'm going to stand over here so I'm not in his way. There's ASIS, femur. Okay, go ahead and make your movement out. Good job. Okay, and that's about 50 degrees. Now we're going to do internal rotation. We're going to sit at the edge of the bed. I am going to stabilize his femur to prevent his abduction and adduction of the femur. And my fulcrum is going to be at the patella. My proximal arm is perpendicular to the floor, and my distal arm is following the tibia tuberosity if you want. Okay. Okay. And go ahead. Good job. and that's about 25 degrees. Okay, now I am going to do the knee flexion extension. For both movements, I am going to stabilize the hip to make sure that there's not ab and adduction taking place as well as rotation. For both movements, I'm going to use the same landmarks. So it's going to be the lateral epicondyle of the femur. My proximal arm is going to follow the femur, the lateral femur, and my distal arm is going to follow the lateral fibula, tibia. Okay, here we go. So I'm on the femur, I'm on the lateral epicondyle. Okay, and the fibula, tibia. Okay, go ahead and slide your heel and toe up. And that's about 135 degrees. Good job. And then for extension, I'm just going to have him walk his knee out and try and push down. Using the same landmarks, so the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and the lateral line of the fibula, and the lateral femur, lateral epicondyle of the femur, not humerus. Okay, go ahead and lock it up. Good job. And he got about 3 degrees. Okay, now I am going to do the ankle. I'm going to do dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, and inversion. So for dorsiflexion, I am going to stabilize the tibia and the fibula. My fulcrum is going to be at the lateral malleoli. My proximal arm is following the fibula, parallel to the fibula, and my distal arm is following the 5th metatarsal. Okay, go ahead and point your toes up. And that's about 60 degrees. My next is going to be plantar flexion, and I'm going to use the same landmarks. I'm also still stabilizing the tibia and the fibula. So it's the lateral malleoli, the fibula for proximal, and the distal is the 5th metatarsal. Can you pretend that you can hold your leg up like that? Okay. Wouldn't actually have a patient like this, but for viewing and testing. Okay. Now you're going to go ahead and point your toes down. And okay. Now I'm going to do inversion. For inversion, I am going to use the tibiotuberosity for the proximal arm. The fulcrum is at the middle point between the malleoli, and then the distal is following the 2nd metatarsal. I'm stabilizing the tibia and the fibula to prevent added movement. Okay, and your movement is going in. Go ahead. And that's about 30 degrees. Okay.